Hello, I'm Tara Kenyon, and I am here to present today on Risk Culture Eats Strategy for Breakfast Too. So it's a little bit of a facetious title, but we are going to be talking about risk culture and the measurement of it in order to be able to manage it properly. So without further ado, let's move on. In 1962, Canadian Don Richardson and his American wife Carol Soderstrom settled among the 300,000 Sawi people of the Netherlands, New Guinea, which is now Indonesia's Papua province. As Christian missionaries, their job was to voice the redemptive story of Jesus of Nazareth, chronicled in the Christian Bible, to the Sawis. From a cultural and historical perspective, what we're seeing here is two mid-20th century North Americans bringing to a primitive Southern Asian people a narrative about a collection of 6,000-year-old Middle Eastern prophecies fulfilled in the life and death of a single Jewish man who lived in Israel 2,000 years before. Prior to the Richardsons' arrival, the Sawis' only exposure to post-Stone Age culture had been the use of a discarded tin can that had floated downstream from the coastal region of Netherlands, New Guinea. While describing the birth, life, betrayal, death, and resurrection and subsequent atonement of Jesus to the Sawi tribe, the Richardsons discovered that for the Sawis, Jesus's betrayer, Judas, was the hero of the story. So clearly, Jesus's teachings of loving God and neighbor, his miracles, his healings, and death and resurrection were not among the principles that were valued by the Sawi people. Rather, the celebratory uproar that they received over Judas's betrayal apprised the Richardsons that treachery was a chief value within the Sawi culture. This incident was not one that informed the couple of the life and death risk that they faced. After all, missionary work is very risky business. Only 7 years prior to the couple's arrival in Asia, 5 missionaries were killed in September of 1955 by members of the Auca clan. Auca actually is not the word for that particular people, but Auca is actually the word for savage in the language of the neighboring tribe. Another isolated group of people on the other side of the world, deep in the Amazon region of Ecuador. The Sawi people, however, were classified as headhunter cannibalistic. They were considered to be the most violent society on earth at that time. The Dutch government classified them as headhunter cannibalistic, and it's important to know that they were much more dangerous than the Aucas in Ecuador. The Dutch government had refused admission to New Guinea by outsiders for many, many years prior to the couple's arrival. And after all, among the Sawis, toddlers had human skulls for toys, men remained naked until they earned the right to wear a grass skirt, and that earning of wearing a grass skirt was by killing another human being. And in children's stories, heroes are those that form friendships to later betray, kill, and eat the befriended. So, bewildered by the praise of the Sawis awarded to Judas, the missionaries realized that the friendships they extended to this Stone Age group through medical care and gifts of modern tools could be construed by the Sawis as precursors to treachery on their parts. The missionaries say that their subsequent realization became key to recognizing the Sawi view of life and societal norms, that societal norms are bound by a society's culture. But within that remote interior part of Indonesia, where treachery and betrayal are considered ideal and virtuous, the Richardsons found that other tribal traditions were better suited to their message. And the Sowis had an atoning analogy of their own, and it compromised the values of neither the Sowie people or the Richardsons. By changing their approach to work to match the norms of Sowie society, the couple achieved more than moderate success with the work they set out to do. So, about the same time that Don and Carol Richardson lived in New Guinea, a man by the name of David McClellan, while studying popular children's stories of 40 countries, discovered that stories reflect the societal norms and traditions of the cultures in which they're told. Gert Hofstede, the much-cited Dutch organizational anthropologist and social psychologist, considered to be many the doyen of cross-cultural research, states that his cultural dimensions theory has origins in McClellan's work. So Hofstede defines culture as the collective programming of the mind, which distinguishes the members of one category of people from another. The general norms of society, what Hofstede concludes to be those values or behaviors desired within that society, or how people think the world should be, are culture bound, and they are also worded in terms of right or wrong. Now, I'll ask you to comment on this, because this is probably one of the things that I get the most pushback on, is that people typically look at risk, and again, it depends on which culture you're from, but they will look at the word risk as something bad, and we'll continue to talk a little bit about this. So if you've got some comments on that, I'd ask you to please put that in the comments below. So perceptions of risk are culture bound. Risk-taking behaviors being viewed in terms of right or wrong, good or bad, virtuous or evil. If risks and risk-taking are considered to be negative attributes in a culture, that is, they're considered to be either wrong, bad, or evil, approaches to risk management taken on by an organization will reflect strategies designed to minimize or avoid risks. Those tasked with managing risks in an organization will also be considered to be wrong, bad, or evil if those managers' primary missions do not include minimizing or avoiding risks altogether. So this is pretty much what we're going to be talking about today, in looking at the perceptions of risk, that understanding that's culture bound. The reason why I mentioned the Richardsons at the top of this talk was simply because their culture was so significantly different than the Sowie people. And so what we have to see is that in some cultures, certain actions are considered to be very good, while in the exact same action in a different culture, they might be considered to be very bad. So when we look at the selection of risk-taking strategies and approaches to managing risk, understand that these are strongly dependent upon the culture in which the choice is made, and in particular, upon a culture's perception of whether risk is a good or a bad thing. So it is the risk tolerance embedded in the culture of the firm, be it risk-taking or risk-adverse, rather than the actual risk therein, that dictate management strategies and practices, as management practices are culturally dependent. If risks are perceived by a culture to be neither bad or harmful, and/or if risk-taking is considered necessary for innovation and value creation, then constructive failure and risk-taking are encouraged, if not also rewarded. Conversely, if a firm's culture is risk-averse, its strategy would be to minimize or avoid risk altogether, value creation capabilities notwithstanding. Gert Hofstede says what works for one culture may not work for another. And the founder of modern management, Peter Drucker, articulated succinctly, culture eats strategy for breakfast. But if you recall, the Richardsons knew that culture could also eat missionaries for breakfast. All right, so that brings us then to the cultural dimensions theory of Hofstede. And risk culture, in this case, what we want to be able to do in order to define our risk exposure and to identify what that risk culture is, in order to be able to see its effect on risk exposure and its influence on firm value and performance. So when we first look at risk exposure, what we want to be able to do is define it first. In the US, there is a statistical analytics software company called SAS, and they have a database called OpRisk Global Data. This database is actually the world's largest, most comprehensive repository of information on publicly reported operational losses in excess of $1 million US. And it contains events across all industries from countries around the world. And it also contains over 35,000 loss events because they've been collecting this information since 1992. So in order to define risk exposure, I take the global database and move into looking at how we take a look at these risk exposures. And what I do is actually calculate the value at risk of losses per country in order to come up with risk exposure. So in looking at worldwide risk exposure here, we see that the darker countries that like Argentina and Brazil, and the lighter countries which are more or less North America, and then some pockets here, Australia, and so on, is that the risk exposure for these different countries, the darker the color, the higher the risk exposure. So in looking at risk exposure, again, by developing the value at risk of losses per country, we're able to see a picture of which countries or which cultures expose themselves to more risk than others. So when we need to identify the risk culture, what we can do is look at the different items that Hofstede came up with. And so Gert Hofstede came up with cultural dimensions, and his research is commonly recognized among business researchers. And in his original work, Hofstede examines the work-related value patterns that appear in a questionnaire given to over 116,000 industrial workers employed by IBM across 50 countries. And he discovered that individuals within specific countries respond in the same manner. So in other words, your coworkers pretty much view the different items in the exact same way. So the study has grown considerably over the last 4 decades, and the original study contained only these first 4 dimensions: power, distance, individualism, masculinity, and uncertainty avoidance. And then in other studies were made by other people, and more particularly work done by a man by the name of Michael Minkoff in the World's Value Survey. And he came up with long-term orientation and indulgence versus restraint, and added to Hofstede's cultural dimensions. And so now Hofstede and Minkoff partner up, and they publish cultural dimensions that can be listed out. This is the latest, the 2014. That's the latest amount, the latest measures of the cultural dimensions. They do it probably once a decade. So let's look at what these different items are. So power distance, that cultural dimension, this is the acceptance and expectation of the less powerful members of an organization that power is distributed unequally. So subordinates don't expect to take part in decision making, and the boss will make the decisions for them. So power distance measures the extent to which the less powerful members of society expect and accept that power is distributed unequally. Low power distance societies, such as Austria and Sweden, stress shared power, equality and opportunity for everyone, and perceive inequality in power and wealth as a necessary evil that should be minimized. In contrast, high power distant countries, for example, Mexico, the Arab countries, India, comprehend inequality as the basis of social order, where those in power emphasize their position and accentuate authority. Individualism is actually two sides of this coin. So individualism versus collectivism is that it indicates that subordinates and superiors are expected to look after themselves from an individualism perspective. Individualism is contrasted with collectivism, where people are integrated into strong, cohesive in-groups, and the worker is granted job security for remaining loyal to the company. So individualism versus collectivism captures the essential differences in society's resolution of the universal tension between the competing claims of the individual versus the group or the society. And high individualism scores, for example, what we find in the US, indicate society in which ties between individuals are loose and decisions are taken based on individual needs. Conversely, in collectivist societies, such as China, individuals attach high emotional value to belonging to a group. As a result, individuals are more likely to adjust their behaviors and beliefs to match those of a wider group to which they belong. People in individualist societies are more likely than those in collectivist societies to vigorously pursue their personal objectives rather than adhere to others' decisions and interests. In such societies, individuals have substantially greater need for personal achievement and the maximization of private benefits. And this leads to more opportunistic behavior of corporate insiders, even if it violates social harmony. And on the other side of the spectrum, people in collectivist societies have less need for autonomy, and they stress conformity and adherence to societal norms and regulations. Increased identification with a group makes corporate insiders less likely to differentiate between their own and others' welfare, which triggers a sense of shared responsibility and obligation. As a result, individuals in collectivist countries tend to act in accordance with interests of the wider group, even when the decisions or actions might be contradictory to their own interests. Masculinity, or masculine society, is probably a bit of a misnomer, and it's probably one of the cultural dimensions of Hofstede that gets a bit of confusion and a lot of pushback. This refers to the distribution of roles between the genders. The people in a quote-unquote masculine society, which doesn't mean just the men in a masculine society, both male and female in a masculine society are considered to be assertive and competitive. And the culture will exhibit a low score in masculinity. In other words, the flip side, a feminine culture, when both males and females exhibit modest and caring values. So you can see then in countries like the Russian Federation, as opposed to is a bit, and some of the Scandinavian countries are on the low masculinity side, where both males and females exhibit modest and caring values, whereas countries like the US, Australia, much of Europe are considered to be masculine societies, where both males and females exhibit assertiveness and competitiveness, but females to a lesser degree. The next one is uncertainty avoidance. And I don't particularly care for this particular title either, mainly because I define risk as the uncertainty of possible outcomes. So many times uncertainty avoidance is confused with risk avoidance or risk averseness. That is not the case, as we'll see here in very shortly. So uncertainty avoidance indicates to what extent a culture programs its members to feel either comfortable with a high uncertainty avoidance or comfortable with a low uncertainty avoidance in unstructured situations. So an uncertainty avoidance relates to the level of anxiety in a society when it is confronted with an unknown future. So high scores for uncertainty avoidance indicate societies with a low tolerance for unstructured situations and ambiguity. For example, countries like Germany, Greece, and Japan. Now, individuals in high uncertainty avoidance societies are more skeptical about the potential rewards from risky ventures and apply higher discount rates to perceived risks. So low uncertainty avoidance scores, for example, Singapore, Denmark, in contrast, indicate that a country's residents have a higher tolerance for uncertainty and ambiguity, more readily accept change, and take on more and greater risks. Uncertainty avoidance, according to Hofstede, is often expressed through a need for predictability. So if you have a high score in uncertainty avoidance, you just have a very difficult time with not knowing what the future holds. Whereas those in low uncertainty avoidance cultures sort of go with the flow. And again, it's very cultural based. It is not necessarily, again, anything good or bad, just like risks. It is just, it's just the way that society operates. Long-term orientation, which is one of the two added dimensions to Hofstede over time by Michael Minkoff, is related to the importance attached to the future versus the past and the present. So members of a long-term orientation society like Russia, China, most of Europe, and Indonesia show persistence, thrift, and a sense of shame, ordering relationships by status, and they observe that order. Personal adaptability is significant. Long-term oriented societies foster pragmatic virtues, oriented towards future rewards, and in particular saving, persistence, and adapting to changing circumstances. Short-term orientation, in other words, it's a low long-term orientation score. Those cultures, members place an emphasis on quick results where the bottom line is important. Status is not a major issue in relationships, and personal steadfastness and stability are imperative in saving one's space. So short-term societies like Colombia, Argentina, Australia foster virtues related to the past and the present, such as national pride, respect for tradition, and fulfilling social obligations. And the last of the 6 is indulgence versus restraint. When a society that allows relatively free gratification of basic and natural human drives related to enjoying life and having fun, it's considered to be an indulgent society, like all of North American countries, Austria, New Zealand, Chile, and a region on the coast of Africa. The society that suppresses gratification of needs and regulates it by means of strict social norms exhibits restraint, such as a very large portion of Asia. So there have been some other studies with regard to what a risk culture is in reference to Hofstede's cultural dimensions. The first study here on the left is, and in the references that you'll see at the end of this presentation, you'll see where you can find those studies. But this particular study, this first one, says that uncertainty avoidance is risk avoidance, and uncertainty acceptance is risk taking. The next study says the same thing, except it adds the dimensions of power distance and individualism. So meaning that individualism would be likened to the risk-taking attributes of an entrepreneur. And then Hofstede himself, actually back in 1983, and this is prior to the 2 extra dimensions coming in, said that uncertainty avoidance and masculinity together constitute a risk culture. So with low scores for uncertainty avoidance and high for masculinity, then they are a risk-taking culture. But is there really a definitive risk culture? So what I've done is actually say what cultural elements, which cultural dimensions actually have the most effect with regard to value at risk and risk exposure of different countries and cultures. And what I have found is that it is none of those things that the previous studies have done, but rather it's long-term orientation and indulgence. So in other words, if primarily if a culture is very much a long-term oriented society, then they are much more apt to take risks in the present in order to be able to move toward that future. Additionally, it helps that a country shows indulgence. So in other words, a very quick gratification here. And that seems very contradictory, but you'll see that the 2 together actually bring about a risk-taking versus risk-averse culture. So by putting those items together, you can come up with actually a risk dimension or a risk cultural dimension by putting those together. And I'm able then to express which countries are the most risk-taking and the most risk-averse. So the darker the colors here, that is the most risk-taking, and the lighter the colors are the much more risk-averse. So what occurs then is that risk culture's influence on value and performance is very important to know at this point in time. And the idiom, nothing ventured, nothing gained, definitely comes to play here. And that means that the more risk-taking a culture is, the more we see the value and the performance of the country, of the firms within that country will actually perform better. So nothing ventured, nothing gained on one side. So in other words, the more risk-taking you are, the better off your company will perform. So we saw that Peter Drucker said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I have a Kenyan corollary that I've added. And for risk-taking cultures, that's a very good thing. And here's why. Because when we look at firm value, which can be described either as firm value or a dividend payout ratio, but not all firms pay dividends. So we want to take that particular piece out. And we'll see then that firm value and return on equity are probably some of the better ways to be able to measure value, being market value of equity, less the market value of debt for value, and the return on equity for our performance. So if basically what we found is that firms in risk-taking cultures create more value to their stakeholders than those in risk-averse cultures. And firms in risk-taking culture perform better financially than those in risk-averse cultures. The key to this is risk measurement. So one of the other things that Peter Drucker also said was what gets measured gets managed. And so what I like to do is always measure risk exposure by economic capital. And economic capital, or risk capital, represents the estimate of the worst possible decline in a firm's amount of capital at a specified confidence level within a chosen time horizon. Much more simply put, is that economic capital is the best estimate of required capital that firms use internally to manage their own risk. And so if they are taking or keeping capital on hand, it should be at least equal to the amount of economic capital that has been calculated throughout the different portfolios of the firm, different lines of business. So if we were to look at an example here of capital allocation and line of business profitability, what we'll do is we line up each one of the lines of business and measure the economic capital there. And so we can see that our cumulative economic capital is along the x-axis with the return, risk-adjusted return on that capital. So in other words, the amount of money that these different lines of business make, that return on capital, and we see which are the most profitable. So when it comes to making decisions, when we line things up this way, we're able to see what our average risk-adjusted return on capital is, that RAROC number. And we can see then that line of business 5 takes up a considerable amount of our capital here, but it doesn't meet with the mean RAROC. So as far as decisions are concerned, what it could be is raise the price for whatever that line of business is to be able to get a better return on the capital that's held. It could be do more of line of business 1, 2, 3, and 4. It could possibly mean getting rid of line of business 8. It's not that it's not making money, it's just not really performing perhaps as well as it needs to be. So you can see where decision making comes in when you are aware of the risks that are involved in each of the lines of business. And again, we do that by measuring it with economic capital. So what about risk-averse cultures? So if nothing ventured, nothing gained is true, then what about those countries and those cultures, or the firms within those cultures, that don't happen to be able to manage, not manage, but not be able to handle risk-taking activities? So what happens to them? Are they doomed to levels of poverty, as we do see quite a bit in risk-averse cultures? Are they doomed to the unavailability of credit and investment? So what about them? So if we go back then to our uncertainty avoidance dimension, here is where something comes into play. I am not suggesting that a risk-averse culture is an uncertainty avoidance culture. It is not. But in the cases of uncertainty avoidance, we see something that happens that we don't see in countries that have low uncertainty avoidance scores in that dimension. So as I mentioned previously, I don't particularly care for Hofstede's label of uncertainty avoidance. Rather, I like to call it ambiguity avoidance. And what we found is that in ambiguity avoidance cultures, those that have very high scores here, is that in that regulation, particularly regulation of unlikely events, can moderate the effects of ambiguity, thereby increasing participation in financial markets and generating welfare gains. So if we were to go back then and look at some of the items here, and this is, by the way, is the closest you'll ever see me getting to a heat map. I'm not fond of them. I think Alex refers to a lot of the activities around heat maps as risk management 101, which we have decided is a definite failure. But this actually adds in the lines of business, the colorful chart we just saw a few slides ago, and we line up the amount of economic or risk capital in these bubbles, and we can see what, and remember our line of business 5 was that very large capital allocated line of business. So in that case, that's what we've done here. But instead of lining them up with cumulative economic capital, what we've done is we have lined them up with control drivers and a judgment on control drivers and a judgment on business environment, which can be done either by a country's regulators or can be done by internal audit, external audit, and so on. And then if you line it up, then you can see a little bit different picture. You'll see that control drivers are weak in a very complex business environment for this particular line of business. That might mean either you expand the controls or you get out of that line of business as well. So you can use risk and measures of risk specifically to be able to mitigate or to more specifically to be able to make better business decisions. So in ambiguity averse or ambiguity avoidance cultures, by having measurement actually come out and be part of regulation is very important to be able to gain financial gains throughout and better financial performance throughout the life of that firm. So that is a little bit different than what we normally see in risk-taking and risk-taking cultures, but in this particular slide that you see actually works in both ambiguity avoidance cultures as well as risk-taking cultures. These particular items, the control drivers and the business environment, when they are regulated, that tends to definitely take out a lot of the ambiguity on some of these unlikely events. So the resources then for this particular study are listed here. If you do have any questions, I would ask that you put them in the comments, and we can get the answers to anything that you've had to say or any questions that you might have. We can get those to you shortly. So with that, I thank you very much for listening. I really appreciate it.